There comes a moment in the life of every empath when something inside them goes quiet. Not broken, not numb, not cold, just quiet. For years, they felt everything too deeply. Other people's pain became their responsibility. Other people's moods became their burden. Other people's chaos became their home. They stayed longer than they should have, forgave more than they should have, loved harder than anyone ever loved them back. And then one day something changes. They stop explaining. They stop chasing. They stop trying to save everyone. This is not cruelty. This is not selfishness. This is the last phase of healing. When the empath finally detaches, it means the soul has learned what the heart refused to accept for years. And this transformation does not happen all at once. It happens in stages. There are 5 signs that show an empath has reached the final phase of healing. In the beginning, the empath believes love means sacrifice, not the healthy kind of sacrifice that comes from choice, but the kind that slowly erases the self. They grow up feeling that their worth depends on how much pain they can carry for others. If someone is angry, they try to calm them. If someone is sad, they try to heal them. If someone is lost, they feel responsible for showing the way. And over time, this becomes their identity. They are not just kind people, they become emotional caretakers for everyone around them. Many empaths learn this role very early in life. In psychology, this pattern is often called parentification, when a child feels responsible for the emotional balance of the household. The child becomes the listener, the mediator, the one who keeps the peace while the adults lose control. Instead of being protected, they become the protector. Instead of being comforted, they become the comfort. And because this behavior is often praised, you are so mature, you are so understanding, you are the strong one. The empath begins to believe that their value comes from holding everything together. So they learn to read faces before words are spoken. They learn to sense tension before anyone admits it exists. They learn to absorb anger without reacting, to carry sadness without complaining, to stay calm while everyone else falls apart. This ability makes them strong, but it also makes them vulnerable. Because when you become the person who fixes everything, people begin to expect you to fix everything. And the empath, without realizing it, walks into friendships where they are the therapist, relationships where they are the healer, and families where they are the peacekeeper. They become the one everyone calls when life goes wrong, but rarely the one anyone asks, "Are you okay?" At first, they don't question it. They believe this is what love looks like. They believe loyalty means staying no matter how heavy things get. They believe patience will eventually change people. They tell themselves that if they understand enough, give enough, stay long enough, the other person will finally grow, finally heal, finally become who they promised to be. But this belief carries a hidden danger, because it assumes that everyone wants to change, and the moment the empath begins to heal is the moment they see a truth that feels almost cruel at first. Not everyone wants to be saved. Some people want comfort without growth. Some want support without responsibility. Some want forgiveness without change. And the empath, who spent years believing that love can fix anything, struggles to accept that healing cannot be forced on someone who refuses to face themselves. There is a story often told in therapy about a woman who spent nearly 10 years trying to help her partner overcome his addictions, his anger, and his constant negativity. She read every book she could find. She encouraged him to get help. She stayed patient when he failed, stayed loyal when he hurt her, stayed hopeful when there was no reason left to hope. She believed that if she loved him enough, he would eventually become the person she saw inside him. But years passed and nothing truly changed. Only her exhaustion grew. One day, after another long conversation about his behavior, her therapist said something simple, almost cold, but impossible to forget. "You are not responsible for someone who refuses to be responsible for themselves." At first, she resisted those words. They felt wrong. They felt selfish. They felt like betrayal. Because for so long, she believed that leaving meant giving up, and giving up meant failing. But slowly, something inside her began to shift. She started to see how much of her life had been spent trying to carry a weight that was never hers. She saw how often she confused love with endurance, compassion with self-neglect, loyalty with silence. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she was not constantly fixing someone. The day she stopped trying to change him was not dramatic. There was no fight, no final speech, no moment of revenge. She simply stopped holding what he refused to hold himself. And strangely, that was the day she felt lighter than she had in years. This is the moment when detachment begins for the empath. Not when they stop caring, but when they understand that caring does not mean sacrificing their own soul. Not when they become cold, but when they stop setting themselves on fire to keep others warm. They realize that compassion without boundaries turns into self-destruction, and love without limits turns into exhaustion. The empath does not lose their kindness in this stage. They lose the illusion that they are responsible for everyone's healing. And that loss, painful as it is, becomes the first real step toward their own. Empaths often live with the quiet feeling of being misunderstood, not because they cannot speak, and not because they do not try, but because what they see inside people is often deeper than what others are willing to admit even to themselves. They notice the tension behind a smile, the sadness behind anger, the insecurity behind arrogance. They sense shifts in tone, pauses in conversation, small changes in energy that most people ignore. And because they feel these things so strongly, they assume that if they can just explain clearly enough, honestly enough, patiently enough, the other person will finally understand. So they talk. They explain why something hurt them. They explain why they need space. They explain why a certain behavior felt wrong, even if no one else noticed it. They try to put feelings into words, even when those feelings are difficult to describe. And at first, they believe this is how healthy relationships work. They believe that if both people are honest, both people will eventually meet in the middle. But what the empath slowly learns is that understanding does not depend only on how well something is explained. It depends on how willing the other person is to hear it. Many empaths grow up believing that every conflict can be solved through communication. They are told that if you speak calmly, if you stay patient, if you keep trying, people will eventually see your point of view. And because they believe this, they stay in conversations long after those conversations stop being real dialogue and start becoming a cycle. They repeat the same truth in different words, hoping that one day it will land differently. But there is a painful reality that the empath must face in the later stages of healing. Some people do not misunderstand you because you explained poorly. They misunderstand you because understanding you would require them to look at themselves. And that is something they are not ready to do. Psychology shows that people who lack emotional awareness often react with defensiveness when they are confronted with uncomfortable truths. Not because they are evil, and not always because they want to hurt you, but because self-awareness can feel threatening. When someone points out a pattern, a mistake, or a behavior that causes pain, the mind sometimes protects itself by denying it. It is easier to say, "You are too sensitive," than to ask, "Why did my actions hurt you?" It is easier to say, "You are overthinking," than to admit, "I don't want to face what you are seeing." The empath, however, does not understand this at first. They believe that if they stay calm enough, kind enough, reasonable enough, the other person will eventually listen, so they keep talking. They explain their feelings again and again. They try different words, different tones, different approaches. They write long messages. They have long conversations. They replay moments in their mind, wondering how they could have said it better. And every time the other person refuses to understand, the empath feels like they failed. They think maybe they were too emotional, too intense, too complicated. They start questioning their own perception. They begin to wonder if they imagined the problem. This is one of the most exhausting places for an empath to live, because they are not only carrying their pain, they are also carrying the responsibility of proving that their pain is real. But healing changes this pattern in a quiet and powerful way. There comes a moment when the empath notices something they ignored for years. They realize that the same conversation keeps happening with the same person, and it always ends the same way. They realize that no matter how carefully they speak, the other person never really listens. Not deeply, not honestly, only enough to respond, never enough to understand. And in that moment, something shifts inside them. They begin to see that real understanding does not require endless explanation. When someone truly cares, they listen the first time. When someone truly respects you, they try to see your point of view even if they do not agree. When someone truly wants connection, they do not make you fight to be heard every time you speak. This realization is painful because it forces the empath to accept that not every relationship can become healthy, no matter how much effort they put into it. It forces them to let go of the belief that clarity will fix everything. And letting go of that belief feels like losing control, because for so long, explaining was the only way they knew how to keep relationships together. So the day the empath stops explaining is not the day they stop feeling. It is the day they stop begging to be understood. They speak once, maybe twice, but they no longer chase agreement. They no longer argue with people who have already decided not to hear them. They no longer try to prove their reality to someone who benefits from denying it. And this silence is not weakness. It is not passive aggression. It is not pride. It is protection, because the empath finally understands that arguing with someone who is committed to misunderstanding, you will slowly destroy your sense of self. Every time you explain what is obvious to your heart and the other person refuses to see it, a part of you begins to doubt your own perception. And the longer this continues, the more you lose trust in yourself. Detachment begins the moment the empath chooses to protect that trust. They stop talking where their words are wasted. They stop explaining where there is no willingness to listen. They stop fighting to be understood by people who only feel comfortable when you stay quiet. And in that silence, something unexpected happens. For the first time in a long time, the empath feels safe inside their own mind. This is one of the hardest stages in the life of an empath, because it is the stage where they must face a feeling that has controlled them for years without them realizing it. Guilt. Not the healthy guilt that tells you when you have done something wrong, but the heavy, constant guilt that appears whenever you choose yourself instead of everyone else. For most empaths, this feeling did not start in adulthood. It was learned slowly, quietly, in moments that seemed small at the time but shaped the way they see love forever. Many empaths grew up in environments where they were praised only when they were helpful, calm, understanding, or strong. When they stayed quiet during conflict, they were called mature. When they comforted others, they were called kind. When they sacrificed their own needs, they were called good. But when they complained, when they needed support, when they wanted space, the reaction often changed. Suddenly, they were told they were difficult, sensitive, dramatic, or selfish. And the mind of a child learns quickly from patterns like this. It begins to connect love with usefulness, acceptance with sacrifice, and peace with silence. Over time, this becomes an invisible rule inside the empath's mind. If I give, I am loved. If I endure, I am accepted. If I say no, I will lose the connection. This belief follows them into adulthood without them questioning it. They become the person everyone relies on, the one who shows up every time, the one who fixes problems, listens to complaints, and carries emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. And because they are used to this role, they rarely notice how tired they are. They only notice the fear that appears whenever they think about stopping. When an empath first tries to set a boundary, the reaction inside them can feel stronger than the reaction from the outside world. Their mind tells them they are being selfish. Their chest feels tight, as if they are about to hurt someone just by protecting themselves. Even when the boundary is small, the guilt feels huge. They say no to a request and spend hours wondering if they did the wrong thing. They take time for themselves and feel like they are abandoning people. They choose rest and feel as if they are failing someone. This is why guilt becomes the last chain that keeps the empath trapped. Not because people always force them to stay, but because their own mind tells them they are not allowed to leave. The habit of self-abandonment feels normal, and choosing themselves feels like betrayal. Many empaths also carry another dangerous belief without realizing it. They believe that love must be earned again and again. They believe that if they stop giving, people will stop caring. If they stop helping, they will stop being needed. And if they stop being needed, they will be left behind. This fear can keep them in exhausting relationships, overwhelming family roles, and friendships where they give far more than they receive. They stay not because they want to, but because guilt convinces them that leaving would make them a bad person. Healing begins when the empath starts to question this belief. Slowly, they begin to see that real love does not disappear the moment they protect themselves. Real connection does not require constant sacrifice. Real care does not demand that one person carries everything while the other carries nothing. This realization does not come all at once. It comes in small moments, often uncomfortable ones, where the empath does something different for the first time. There was a man who had spent most of his life being the one everyone depended on in his family. If someone had a problem, they called him. If something went wrong, he fixed it. If there was conflict, he tried to make peace. He answered every call, even late at night, even when he had work early in the morning, even when he was exhausted. He told himself that this was what a good son, a good brother, a good person should do. But over the years, the pressure began to wear him down. He felt constantly tired, constantly tense, constantly responsible for things he could not control. One night, his phone rang again after midnight. Someone needed help with a situation that had nothing to do with him, but they expected him to solve it anyway. For the first time, instead of saying yes automatically, he paused. His heart started racing, his mind filled with guilt before he even spoke, but he forced himself to say something he had never said before. He said, "I can't help this time. I need to rest." After he hung up, he felt terrible. He thought he had disappointed everyone. He thought he had been selfish. He thought something bad would happen because he was not there to fix it, but nothing happened. The world did not fall apart. His family did not stop loving him. The problem he refused to carry did not destroy his life. And in that quiet moment, he realized something that changed him. He realized he had never actually been required to carry everyone. He had only believed that he was. This is the moment when detachment begins for the empath. Not when they stop caring, but when they stop believing that caring means losing themselves. They begin to understand that boundaries are not cruelty, and rest is not selfishness. They see that saying no does not make them cold, and choosing peace does not make them weak. It simply makes them human. For the first time, they allow themselves to exist without apologizing for it. They allow themselves to step back without explaining it. They allow themselves to protect their energy without feeling like they owe the world an excuse. And the more they do this, the more the guilt starts to fade, not because they stopped loving others, but because they finally learned to include themselves in that love. Detachment begins the moment the empath chooses peace over approval, and once they feel that peace, even for a second, they realize how heavy the need for approval had been all along. For a long time, the empath stays in places that slowly exhaust them, not because those places feel right, but because leaving them feels even more frightening. The fear is not always of the people themselves. It is the fear of what comes after: silence, distance, emptiness, the feeling of having no one to turn to when the day ends. Many empaths learn very early in life that connection, even painful connection, feels safer than being alone with their own thoughts. So they stay where they are not understood, where they are not valued, where they are not at peace, simply because the idea of loneliness feels heavier than the weight they are already carrying. They would rather sit in a room full of tension than sit in a quiet room by themselves. They would rather explain themselves again and again than face the possibility that no one will listen. They would rather feel drained than feel unwanted. This is one of the most difficult patterns to break, because it does not look like weakness from the outside. It looks like loyalty. It looks like patience. It looks like someone who never gives up on people. But inside, the empath often feels something very different. They feel tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. They feel surrounded, yet alone at the same time. They feel like they are constantly adjusting themselves just to keep relationships from falling apart. The truth is that many empaths do not fear being alone because they cannot handle solitude. They fear being alone because, for most of their life, their identity was built around being needed. When you spend years being the one who listens, the one who helps, the one who understands everyone else, you begin to forget who you are when no one needs anything from you. And the moment life becomes quiet, the question appears: if I am not fixing anyone, if I am not helping anyone, if I am not holding everything together, who am I? So the empath stays busy with people, even the wrong people, because activity feels safer than emptiness. Chaos feels familiar. Noise feels familiar. Being needed feels familiar. Solitude, on the other hand, feels unknown, and the unknown can be terrifying when your sense of self has always depended on others. But healing changes this in a slow and almost invisible way. As the empath begins to understand themselves, something inside them becomes more stable. They start to notice their own feelings without immediately reacting to them. They learn to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. They begin to see that being alone does not mean being abandoned. It simply means being with themselves, without distraction, without performance, without the constant pressure to hold someone else together. Studies on emotional regulation show that people who develop strong self-awareness become less dependent on external validation. When a person learns to understand their own emotions, their own limits, and their own needs, they no longer require constant reassurance from others to feel stable. Their sense of identity becomes internal instead of external. They do not need to be surrounded by people to feel real. They do not need approval to feel valuable. They do not need noise to escape their own mind. This is exactly what begins to happen to the healed empath. At first, solitude feels uncomfortable. The silence feels loud. Without the usual problems to solve and emotions to manage, they feel restless, almost guilty for not being busy with someone else's life. But the more time they spend alone, the more they begin to notice something surprising. The quiet is not hurting them. The quiet is healing them. They start to think more clearly. They start to breathe more easily. They start to feel a kind of peace they did not know they were missing. There is a story about a man who spent years surrounded by people who constantly needed something from him. His friends called him whenever they had problems. His relationships were filled with drama, arguments, and emotional ups and downs. He told himself that this was normal, that this was what life looked like, that having people around all the time meant he was not alone. But whenever he finally had a moment to himself, he felt uneasy. He would turn on the television, call someone, scroll through his phone, anything to avoid sitting in silence in his apartment. After going through a period of deep personal change, he slowly started spending more time by himself. Not because he wanted to be lonely, but because he was tired of feeling drained. At first, the evenings felt strange, too quiet, too empty. He kept expecting the old restlessness to return, but instead, something else happened. He began to enjoy the calm. He began to notice that he felt more like himself when no one was pulling on his energy. Years later, when someone asked him why he seemed so different, he said something that surprised everyone around him. He said, "I finally enjoy my own company more than most conversations." That sentence sounds simple, but for an empath, it represents a huge transformation. It means they are no longer afraid of being alone with their thoughts. It means their sense of worth no longer depends on being needed. It means they can choose connection instead of clinging to it. And this is the moment when detachment becomes real. Not when the empath stops loving people, but when they stop staying in places that make them feel small just to avoid feeling alone. They begin to understand that loneliness is not the same as solitude, and noise is not the same as connection. They see that being surrounded by people who do not respect them can feel far more empty than sitting quietly by themselves. Detachment begins when the empath realizes that peace in solitude is healthier than chaos in company, and that being alone is not something to fear when it means finally being free. This is the final phase, the stage that many empaths never imagine they will reach, because for most of their life they believed their purpose was to be available to everyone. They believed their role was to understand, to forgive, to make space, to give one more chance, and then another after that. They felt responsible for keeping connections alive, even when those connections slowly drained the life out of them. But in the last phase of healing, something changes at the deepest level of the mind. The empath stops seeing everyone as their responsibility. This change does not happen suddenly. It comes after years of exhaustion, after countless moments of feeling used, misunderstood, or overlooked. It comes after realizing that kindness without limits invites people who have no limits. And when this realization finally settles in, the empath begins to move differently through the world. They become more selective, more observant, more protective of their energy. Not because they want to push people away, and not because they have become bitter, but because they have finally learned the cost of letting everyone too close. For most of their life, the empath believed that being a good person meant giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. They trusted easily. They forgave quickly. They ignored small signs because they wanted to see the good in people. When someone disappointed them, they explained it away. When someone crossed a line, they told themselves it was not that serious. When someone took advantage of their kindness, they thought maybe the person was just hurting. This way of seeing the world came from a beautiful place, but it also left them open to people who recognized that kindness and learned how to use it. Healing begins when the empath understands that seeing the good in people does not mean ignoring what is real. They start to notice patterns they once avoided. They start to remember how many times the same behavior repeated. They start to see that words can sound sincere while actions tell a completely different story. And instead of rushing to excuse it, they allow themselves to observe. Before healing, the empath gives everyone the benefit of the doubt. After healing, they give people the benefit of observation. They watch how someone behaves when they are frustrated. They watch how someone reacts when they hear the word no. They watch how someone treats them when they are no longer useful. This is not suspicion. This is awareness. It is the understanding that character is revealed in patterns, not promises. The empath no longer feels the need to decide quickly who deserves their trust. They allow time to show the truth. And this alone changes everything, because people who once relied on the empath's endless patience begin to feel something different. They feel distance. They feel limits. They feel that the door is no longer wide open. For the empath, this can feel strange at first. They are used to being the one who explains, the one who stays, the one who tries again. But now, when something feels wrong, they do not rush to fix it. They do not argue for hours trying to make the other person understand. They do not chase someone who is pulling away. They do not beg for the same respect they have given freely for years. Instead, they step back. This stepping back is one of the clearest signs that healing has reached its final stage. Not because the empath stopped caring, but because they finally understand that caring does not mean allowing everything. They see that every time they ignored their own limits in the past, they paid for it with their peace. Every time they kept the door open for someone who only came to take, they lost a part of their energy that never fully returned. There is a moment that many empaths experience where they look at their life and realize how many people had access to them simply because they never learned how to say no. Friends who only called when they needed something. Relationships where they gave more than they received. Family roles where they were expected to carry everyone's emotions without complaint. And they see clearly, sometimes for the first time, that access to them was never meant to be unlimited. This realization does not make them cold. It makes them careful. They begin to understand something most people learn too late. Access to you is a privilege, not a right. Not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay close to your heart. Not everyone who asks for your time deserves your energy. Not everyone who says they care is capable of respecting you. And once the empath truly understands this, they stop trying to keep every door open. They start to see boundaries in a new way. For most of their life, boundaries felt like walls, something harsh, something selfish, something that would push people away. But now they see that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks. Doors can still open. People can still come in. Connection is still possible. But the lock means that not everyone walks in without permission. And the empath, for the first time, holds the key. When someone shows respect, the door opens. When someone shows consistency, the door opens. When someone shows honesty, the door opens. But when someone lies, takes, manipulates, or ignores their limits, the door stays closed. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. This is the moment where detachment becomes complete, because the empath no longer feels responsible for keeping every relationship alive. They no longer feel guilty for protecting their peace. They no longer feel the need to explain why they stepped back. Detachment begins when the empath stops opening the door for people who only come to take, and in that moment, they discover something they searched for their entire life. Not approval, not validation, not constant connection, but something far more rare. They discover what it feels like to belong to themselves. When the empath finally detaches, people often say, "You changed. You became cold. You're not the same anymore." And they are right, because the empath is no longer living in survival mode, no longer trying to earn love, no longer trying to heal people who enjoy being broken. They did not lose their kindness. They learned where it belongs. And this is not the end of their heart. This is the beginning of their freedom.